sexual harassment and sexual abuse in schools. I'm really glad to have you all with us because we have such a fantastic panel to talk to you about that today. I'm essentially going to start off by not speaking very much like Goldie, handing over to each of you to okay, if you want it.
Way to bribe.
I'm an earlier teacher by trade, so people getting up to get things in the middle of sleeping is going to be absolutely fine. So, could you start off by giving the audience a 2-minute introduction to yourselves and your expertise in this area? Jamie, could you perhaps start us off?
Sure. Hello everybody, thank you for coming to the session. So my name is Jamie and I'm co-founder of an organisation called Life Lessons. We're relatively new, we're working with 100 schools across the UK, from Scapeness down to Bristol and Elementary, and we support schools with their whole school approach to addressing behaviour abuse. But specifically what we do is a full RSHE curriculum. We do teacher training and we've got full-time activities. And the thing that makes what we do a bit different is that we bring the voice of young people into the classroom through videos in order to model the discussion. So for instance, we video young people talking candidly about why would a boy take a photo up the skirt of a girl and share it with his friends? How would that make a girl feel? We've got videos of this sort of content with really young people from across the UK talking about these things. And then these videos can be used in the classroom and they're useful tools for teachers to then be a facilitator of those discussions and for pupils to explore some of the why about this issue that we're going to explore today.
Thanks so much. Hello, I'm Anna Shapiri. I am an ex-teacher, school leader, youth worker, and just work with lovely people at Centre for Education and Youth. I then went to work at Ofsted and was the leader of the Sexual Abuse Review in schools and colleges. And now I work at the Campus Enterprise Trust, so big national trust of 57 schools is their head of change. There's lots of things to change in a good way.
Suzi. I'm Suzi Godson. I am a research psychologist. For the last 17 years I've written a weekly column about sex and relationships in the Times newspaper. But my main focus is, in 2017 I launched a peer support app for young people called MeeToo, and it's anonymous, pre-moderated, and it allows young people to talk about difficult things such as sexual assault, sexual abuse, sex, relationships, and to ask all the questions that they need help with and to get answers from young people of their own age. And there's also an amazing extensive directory of educational resources and videos, and it's been independently evaluated and proven to improve mental health for young people, that just happened last year, and it's free for kids, so if you want to ask me about it later.
I also realised I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Ellie Mulcahy. I always do that. I'm Director of Research and Ops at the Centre for Education. So that's us, but I am just chairing today. Anna, I wonder if you start off, seeing as you did the review in that last year, by giving us an overview of the current state of play in schools. What do we know about what's happening in this issue?
Yeah, so I'll sort of start by giving a bit of an overview. I'll also say, as I probably should caveat, I'm not here as like the voice of Ofsted or government, but as someone who was steeped in that piece, it feels important just to outline some really key things. So many of you sat here anyway will be very aware of these issues, particularly if you work with children and young people. And so many of you people will be aware of just some of the problems in our society in general when it comes to misogyny and how sexual abuse is or isn't paid attention to. I think the extra dimension that was particularly troubling about this review that we unearthed, but partly off the back of the Everyone's Invited website, I want to mention that piece, was just how systemic people's exposure to online abuses. And that's the bit I think professionals, we haven't really collectively got a handle on. There's obviously pockets of good practice, but actually it shouldn't be the case that 9 out of 10 girls are saying that they receive unsolicited videos or pictures that they or their peers a lot or sometimes. It shouldn't be the case that 51% of boys say that happens to them either. I think everyone suffers when this kind of behaviour is going on. And again, 9 out of 10 girls saying that actually sexualised name calling happens a lot or sometimes to them or their peers. These things are just the bread and butter for some young people, quite a lot of young people it turns out, and actually I think we're failing our young people to not really acknowledge that and help them have the tools to navigate what is actually really, really tough terrain. I struggle with it, I find it really hard, and yet we're asking our 12, 13, 14-year-olds, sometimes even younger children, to manage that, whilst there's also in the mix much more hardcore pornography that they're seeing from a really young age. So I think I don't want to do the battle cries of, oh, children aren't safe in schools, that's not helpful. Actually, largely, people say they feel physically safe in schools. Some girls reported an unwanted touching in corridors, and that is a real problem to address. But largely it was the online space that they found particularly troubling, and this kind of low level, but over time, really harmful sexual behaviour in terms of name-calling harassment. So it's a normalisation of that.
And I just want to pick up on something you said there in terms of everybody suffers, and that you've asked children, young people of different genders, their experiences. Jamie, I know you've also got some thoughts on this by every which way. To what extent is this a gendered issue? It affects only girls, primarily girls? How are boys affected, both by the issues itself and the way that we address them?
Yeah, so there's something there about, so firstly I'll do the upfront bit, which is to say that for this review, whereas our LGBTQ plus groups, we went and asked to speak to them and they told us about their views, and we did cut the survey results to see how things played out for them too. So we know particularly, and the evidence bears this out from other studies as well, that children who identify either with different gender or sexuality than just being heterosexual, they have at least the same, if not more, issues in terms of how things affect them, and they reported particularly feeling physically unsafe at school in a way that girls and boys didn't. So it's just important to name that. But actually there's this other bit, and it was something that I was really determined to not fall into the trap of when we were doing this piece. I didn't want this report or this issue to become the next culture war. And I think it's a really important piece. I didn't want it to be like, who is right and who is wrong in this? And who is more liberal in this and everything. Basically, this is an issue that affects all of our children and young people, whether you think it or not. It's the tip of the iceberg, obviously. You need to really be able to look into this to get to some of the solutions for young people. So let's not just make boys feel shit about what they're doing wrong. Because I think some of the boys who spoke to us and our staff who were doing the research, they were like, we're worried and we feel like we're to blame for everything. And that's not a great position to then move everybody on from. And also boys were saying, we don't want to see some of this stuff. I don't want to be part of that, but you can't get pressured into it. But I think it's important to acknowledge that it's just not a healthy environment for any young person, whatever gender. But of course, many of the stories we've heard disproportionately impacted by us in our experiences.
Jamie, do you think?
We agree with that point. We see this anecdotally here that some of the lessons that are going on in schools now around sexual harassment can generally get boys backed up and can be counterproductive in some ways because it causes resentment. And we recommend, and this is, we don't claim to be experts on this, but there's a few principles that I think could be useful. Those are, as Anna says, this is a societal challenge. It's always existed. Sexual harassment has always existed. And so there's an opportunity with us in this room, but in a classroom as well, for everyone there to be aligned on this is a problem, and let's understand what it is and why it's a problem. And then also acknowledge that we've all got some control and power to make a difference to that. That's boys and girls.
I would sort of fundamentally disagree. I don't think girls have any power in this, and I think that they are predominantly the ones that are affected. And we have a 1.3% conviction rate for rape in this country, and girls cannot talk to anybody at school about it because they know that nothing will be done about it. And that creates anger. Girls are really angry about this, and that anger causes conflict between boys and girls. And the fact that there's no clarity around boundaries, and that relates to the fact that sex and relationships education is so hopeless. I think you can't dismiss the experiences of girls. I've been running a survey about this issue, and I just want to read you what happens to girls when they have been sexually assaulted or raped. So this is one girl. She says, "I can no longer do simple things such as shower. So disgustingly, I don't shower that often, and it causes me so much distress. I can't look at myself naked, I can't look in the mirror, I have major trust issues. I harm myself because I disgust myself. What happened to me caused me to make an attempt in my life, which obviously failed. I'm still here, but I'm not the same person. People who've been raped and sexually assaulted are 13 more times more likely to kill themselves. They are 29 times more likely to have issues with self-harm and substance abuse. We can't diminish that. We can't say, well, we need to be nice to boys. We really have to tackle it on the chin.
That's what we were saying.
No, I think, what they were saying is how you can address it in a way that doesn't demonise all boys and lead to them actually checking out.
Well, there needs to be clarity, and the clarity needs to come from sex and relationships education. I think that what Jamie's doing with using video as we depersonalise it. We live in a society where there's so much shame and stigma around sex and relationships. It's hard for adults to talk about sex with each other. Let alone getting untrained, underqualified teachers to deliver sex education to kids. In our survey, 70% are just taught by regular teachers. So schools realise that's a problem, and now they're outsourcing, but outsourcing isn't regulated either. So, you've got activist groups, you've got political groups coming in under it's mandatory, it's not regulated. So it's a mess.
I'll give 2 minutes quick thoughts.
Don't be sorry, you're here. You're absolutely fine. I'm so sorry for not being in top bangers. We've got to start the discussion. I've got some questions for you.
Brilliant.
Take a moment to breathe. Okay, everybody, this is Caroline. She's head teacher. I'll let her introduce herself properly. Jamie, do you want to come back on this?
Yeah,
Crucial point.
and I also recognise your point that we've all been affected one way or another. I acknowledge that if there ever are situations happening in London, that terrible case and murder, the spotlight that shone on the problem in wider society did make me and other men that are out there think it's very different living in the world as a woman as it is a man, and so we need to improve empathy and understanding of boys to girls, and saying you're the problem isn't a great entry point to that. A better entry point is that there is a problem. Society is set up to feed that problem and perpetuate the problem from the media to everything. And so let's unpick it. Let's think about, first of all, to say, how in your story, boys should hear stories like that. We need to understand what this problem looks like and how it feels to somebody. And we also need to understand some of the root causes, like why would a boy behave on a much lower level than the example you just gave, but unwanted touching or a comment or why do we do these things? And clearly there's things like peer pressure and there's things like this idea of masculinity. There's a factor there for sure, but having a slide up on and just stating the fact toxic masculinity is the problem here, let's move on, isn't I don't think the way to do it. We need to really, we all go through our lives living as we, without often questioning why we behave certain ways and why we do certain things, and that's why therapy is great, because it helps you have a time and space and a safe environment to unpick these things and to understand things. And so schools, it's a big challenge for schools to have time and space to do that, and it's a lot of responsibility to do that, and they can't be the only people in solving this problem for society. But lots of really good work.
So I'll just pick on a particular point that you made there, Jane, about sort of different levels of behaviour and bringing into that session. Right, first of all, if you introduce yourself and start your answer, I really wanted to ask you, I know a lot of the work that you've done in your school is about prevention, catching things early, addressing issues early so that they don't escalate. I think people in the room would be interested in how do you set that up, and also how can teachers, especially new, perhaps inexperienced teachers, know what to look out for and when to sort of jump on those things to make sure we're doing that prevention of the sort of lower level end of behaviours without minimising the impact of any.
Okay, hi, my name is Caroline Barlow. I'm head teacher of an 11 to 18 currently maintain school in the middle of East Sussex. We are pretty rural. We're an iPad school, and there's a reason, I suppose, why I would mention some of those factors, in that school is where a lot of our students meet each other, because they come from miles on a bus to get to us every day. They don't necessarily automatically live near to, well, anyone or each other. Therefore, their online friendships, whether it's on the phone or on the iPad, which we monitor hugely, it is a fundamental part of their interaction. So we can't choose to ignore online activity when we're having any of these conversations. It has to be wrapped into its entirety. I think it's really interesting, and I'm terribly sorry that I missed what you were saying, but I'm kind of picking up and reading between the lines. I completely understand where Jane is coming from. I've looked back to a conversation that I had with a highly articulate Year 11 about 4 years ago, and he had got himself into a really tricky position with some of my more ardently feminist English teachers. And his argument was, all you ever do is talk about how crap men are. That's all you ever talk about, and how hard done by women are. Where does that leave me? And it kind of prompted something in me to start thinking about, all we're doing, potentially, is imposing the issues that I grew up with, that many of us grew up with, into the thought processes of the young people around us. And actually I wanted to flip the conversation. What is their experience? What are they hearing? What are they feeling? What are they thinking? That should be what's informing what we construct and how we construct it. There's many layers of how we use student voice in everything that we do, but this was a fundamental part of it. Never mind the fact that it's required when you set up the new policy and all the rest of it. It's actually really important, not just that they have a voice in what you do, but how you do it. And to start to understand what they view as casual language and what they view as formal language, what they view as an insult, what they don't, and why they don't. And even that needs unpicking at times. So yeah, it's about getting into things early on. It's that unanswerable, really tricky thing to do of establishing culture and ethos that is built on compassion, understanding and equality. And that's what we keep coming back to all the time. That this is about understanding each other and it's about equality. And if it's neither of those things, then it's not okay. We have a rhetoric of unkind language, unkind physicality, and we relentlessly ask people to be vigilant for it, and we ask students to report on it. We did a survey 12 months ago with students and asked them, do you hear language? We were doing work on all the protected characteristics, but we focused specifically on sexism and racism. Do you hear this language? Has it been directed at you? If so, did you report it? And if you reported it, what happened? And essentially what it told us was they hear it. We were fortunate. The feedback told us in our place it's not widespread. It was isolated incidents, but literally hardly anyone reported it. And we're sat there literally screaming it. But if we don't know, how can we do anything about it? And why are you not reporting it? They're not reporting it because they think it's normal, because it's what they hear all around them. That is not the school's fault. That's not their fault. It's not necessarily their parent or their environment's fault. It's all of our fault. It's the society. I was listening to something a while back. You're going to have to shut me up in a minute. That actually, part of our battleground is not just enabling women and young women to survive the patriarchy, but it's actually about liberating young men too, from the expectations it puts on them, from the stereotypes that it puts on them, how they choose to define themselves or find it really difficult to define themselves in different ways than that which is expected. And therefore, unpicking all of that and being willing to have those conversations with young people is potentially some of the most powerful things that we've done. We've facilitated that through student council, through house councils, through group focus work. We've got a TV station where we've given them free rein. So we run a TV and a radio station. It's one of the perks of having the iPads and the technology and some people who've helped us set it up. But we basically say, fine, go run a programme on it. So they've done programmes on racism, sexism, disability. Interestingly, they're still not brave enough to run one on sexuality. but we know that it's an ongoing conversation we need to have. And they're just about to launch one entitled It's Not Okay, where they're kind of mimicking, I don't know if you've ever seen the John Lewis version of one where it's all around, that's not okay, but this is. So it's starting that conversation of, I don't find that okay, but actually this is fine. Let's start that conversation and let's build it together. So I'll just probably, it's an ongoing piece of work would be what I'm saying, but it is working, but it's relentless. It's about consistently staying on top of it, because as adults, staff are all too willing to just view the casual comments as casual comments, and because they've grown up with them and heard them, we have to keep reminding them, no, that's not okay, and you need to log it, because then the education starts. Sorry.
I didn't want to interrupt you, but this really told us around, so I can say much about it. We talked a lot there about sort of this sort of relentless supervision of what's going on and trying to prevention of that. Of course, sometimes really bad stuff is happening. And Suzi, I'd like to invite you to say a little bit about what you've heard from young people about the impact of what's happening. I know you've got a particular sort of mental health angle on that. In our panel this morning, Alex was talking about mental health and the impact of the pandemic. So I just thought that was really useful to know.
Well, it does, the impact on mental health. When I set up the app, I originally set it up so it would be a safe place for young people to talk about all this stuff. And the remit then extended to mental health. And I don't think I quite realised at the time how interlinked those two things were. But, as part of this survey process, I ran looking at co-occurring topics across 1 million data points that we've already gathered in the app. And if you look at the topic sexual assault, sexual abuse, and you look at it in terms of depression, anxiety, PTSD, self-harm, suicidal ideation, there's almost 2 to 3 times more experience of those mental health issues in young people who have been sexually assaulted. And if you look at women, or young girls aged 16 to 24, 1 in 4 of them self-harms, 1 in 4 of them has been sexually assaulted or raped. In that age group, the suicide rate is rising faster than in any other demographic. Now, I know that correlation isn't causation, but the overlap is too strong for it to be ignored. We have a mental health crisis in this country, and we look at it in isolation. We don't look at what is going on around that. We look at young people are self-harming, they're having suicidal thoughts, they're depressed, they're anxious, and we don't ask why. And sexual abuse, sexual assault, sexual harassment are a really big part of that. And I'd urge anybody in education who's talking to people who are suffering from mental health issues to explore that territory, because I'm pretty sure that we will find a relationship between the two things.
And also, obviously, relationship and sex education is a really big part of this. Jamie, Anna, I wonder if you'd like to comment on what the role is alongside all of the stuff that Caroline mentioned about, alongside the societal stuff, alongside the sort of behavioural policies that have to go across the whole school. There's sort of relatively new RSHE curriculum. Not all schools are finding it easy to dive into that. What's its role? Where are we now? Where do we need to go?
Sure. I think first of all, it's really important to acknowledge the impact of that Ofsted report and everyone's invited, because it has, from my perspective, working in schools, seemed to really result in leadership teams and governors taking notice of this, and there's some accountability there now through school inspection, and that's really, so things are changing. There's an appetite. And one of the biggest things that seemed to change was siloed functions in schools working together. So previously it seemed like safeguarding was more of a reactive function in schools. And what we're seeing now is more the DSL, the pastoral lead, the RSHE lead, working collaboratively perhaps with many others within the school, acknowledging that this is a problem and looking at that whole school approach, where is this needed? So equipping young people with skills and knowledge to actually be safer and avoid some of the stuff if possible, whether that's avoiding because there's a potential perpetrator of some of the stuff, or whether it's avoiding in terms of just good decision making all around, basically. So that's all good. What's you go?
Where RSHE currently landscape,
Where it
where it is and where it needs to be.
Yeah, so there's some challenges. So there's a real disparity in the amount of time allocated in schools. So some schools do this in formal time, so 20 minutes once a week, something like that. Because there's lots of other things to cover. And when it comes to UCAS time and exam time, everything is kind of gets moved to the side. So that's another emphasis on it needs to be whole school because it can't all do it it's cheap. So that's a problem. Staff, team confidence is a problem. So the team need to be confident to facilitate these decisions, the conversations around sensitive topics, and there is a worry of saying the wrong thing. Especially I spoke to a school this week, you might have 50 people in a school who are teaching this, because they're form tutors. And so because we met with the comment was made on the call I had that in some ways they're the largest faculty. The people that are delivering the subject, but the support within getting quite slim. So that relatable resources for young people, so that they're not just looking at PowerPoint presentations with lots of words on them. Because what is the consequence of that is that young people go to TikTok for the answer set and for information, and that's accessible, and you can find something that's tailored for you. Because that's another key thing, that this subject still has a distance to move for inclusivity. So if you're in a wheelchair, this subject should speak to you. If you're black, white, North of England, South of England, this should speak to you. And of course, gender is part of that as well. And there's distance to travel there. So look, one positive thing is, and definitely a shout out to RSHE leads in schools, because they're total heroes. Like they understand why this is important and have done for a long time. And they're typically working with not a lot of resource. They're getting more support now, but still they're the people that are working their holidays and their weekends, pulling together these resources like frantic magpies, good magpies from YouTube and all sorts of things to then disseminate them out to their teams with very little coming back to them. Like impact is another challenge. Like, are we changing attitudes? Are we changing behaviour? There's more work that needs to be done there too.
This is really hard. Like, it's a really obvious thing to say, but schools and teachers do a really good job. I would almost say sometimes it's worth thinking really carefully before you do something a bit not great. So like it's better to hold off and have a proper think about what you do before you charge in and do something that actually makes kids go, well, I know they weren't interested in it, because they, like, some of the teachers we spoke to were like, yeah, I get the PowerPoint in the actual form due time, and then I open it and I deliver it. I haven't got time to do anything else. So like, I get that people are stretched. But again, the children and young people said to us, we know when the teachers aren't interested in it, and then of course we're not going to go and talk to them about this actual other thing that is happening, because it's like their second job. And so there's something really mindful about where's the core of your expertise, and if you don't have it, bring it in. But before you disseminate out, just make sure you're really, really careful thought and time. So, if we thought and have the same kind of curriculum rigour that we did in some subjects, for what does RSE look like, and I guarantee you'd start with the impact instead of just going, well, here's this random YouTube video, let me just get this, let me get that, because it's just an emergency and it's a gap. Children told us that they watched a cup of tea consent video, like time after time again, and it's like that can only go so far. Look it up, there's a swear in it, but it's worth seeing. And I think where you see gaps, particularly around sexuality stuff, actually, we know that children who are LGBTQ+ are at more risk of exploitation because they go online to look for their gaps. And that's a really tricky area for schools where they're not feeling confident in themselves, and where the government's like, oh, we're going to give you guidance, but not quite yet. So it's a tricky one to talk about. But if we don't fill that gap with professionals, something else will, and I can guarantee you that comes with a higher level of risk than what you could offer them. And I would say the same for how you work with the parents as well. We were talking earlier, weren't we? How do you bring parents into that conversation so that you all have similar messages and understanding? And Carol, I remember you were talking earlier about
working with the language and the circumstances of the children are in. That's so important because there is a level of understanding of your teaching staff where they're like, that's just a bit of banter, isn't it? And we spoke to governors who are like, oh, it's just blokish banter, boys will be boys, all the rest of it. And they're like, no, for goodness sake. So there is definitely that something about resetting your teaching staff's understanding of what does harmful sexual behaviour look like before you even then go into the next level. Now let's cascade that out to our young people because that feels important. All in an age-appropriate way, but it does feel important.
Just looking at time, I'd really like to have some audience questions. And then we'll see how we vote for perhaps one as well. Any questions?
I've got 2 questions. They're kind of linked. Firstly, you mentioned the cup of tea video. So we show it in our school. Personally, my view is that actually it's not a video that I like because I think that the kids need it in a more kind of clear way. Have you found ways of making that video clear to the students so that, again, like real without necessarily going to the really extreme way of like scaring them and going, if at any point it's no, then it's right. Without going like making them think everything's really wrong, but also maybe a bit more context into it than if they want to come to see and change their mind.
Yeah, people are like, come on.
Yeah, because I think what I find personally in our schools, they just tend to find it a bit more comical that side. So just trying to find a way of getting that balance between understanding but also not kind of fear-mongering with them.
I think there's a couple of really valid points that have been raised already around the team that are delivering the material. So I'm really fortunate that we have a highly experienced PSC lead. We made the decision that PSC would only be delivered by the heads of year. So they are the team and they get the training and they spend time talking about the resources. Therefore it's delivered in a lesson, it's never delivered in a 20-minute session. I think there is something about teenagers find all of these conversations both slightly awkward and also fascinating. Absolutely, and I've sat around enough conversations at my own dinner table with my kids going, oh my god, you're not going to raise this, are you? Yes, I am. And so there's an element of allowing humour to be a gateway sometimes, but actually it's the conversations that we give them the space to have. Whilst acting as almost a facilitator to those, they are really good at, I say this, and I appreciate that I'm saying it from the context of my school and the culture that we've spent time enhancing, so it may not be true anywhere in other places, but they are, I find, they're really good at kind of just holding each other to account without falling out with each other, raising things, discussing things, having articulate conversations with each other. They're really respectful of where they're trying to come from and how they're trying to learn. And it's really about the skill set, the time, and facilitating those conversations.
Do you think maybe a bit better using that kind of thing in a discussion rather than historically?
It should be the
We've
vehicle
had it
of
as
the conversation.
a video, and that's where you can't kind of talk, and that's why you kind of get them.
No, things like that for me are the vehicle to the conversation, they're not the conversation in itself.
And sorry, the other question comes more for you in the school. How would you get them so that the students don't see it as kind of this is what we're learning now, like it's an ongoing thing. So obviously it's not like a one-off, you might have a one-off lesson on it, but it's something you learn to kind of be constantly thinking. Do you kind of do anything within the school to help them to see that all the time?
Yeah. So we fed it into what was already our existing ethos and culture. So we have what we call our habits. They speak a lot to compassion and consideration. They speak to honesty and integrity are two of our kind of core values, and they are as important to us as the kind of get an A in your maths type of conversation. And we're very outspoken about. You can be, and I have to be careful at the moment because it sounds like I'm being political and I'm genuinely not. But we do talk a lot about you can have as many qualifications as you like, but if you're going to hold a top job, you actually have to be a decent person as well, and you have to have integrity. Now I've been saying that for about 10 years, and but actually we think it's really important. So all of those conversations are hinged around who we define ourselves as. And in that sense, you could argue we create that kind of microcosm of this is what a good student is, this is what they stand for, and that's not what we do here. And therefore we're able to have those conversations at a reasonably low level, because it's just a kind of, oh, and rebalancing. And fortunately, over time, you change a culture, that is the norm, and therefore behaviour out of the norm is different. Now, where it gets more complicated is when we're then dealing with behaviours that have happened outside of school. And that's the crossover point where you are then dealing with generational differences of opinion.
Thank you.